May 1947. A frail old man steps out of a car on a lonely California hilltop. This is the dark story of America's wildest party palace, Hearst Castle. For almost 30 years, this place was the craziest playground for the rich and famous. Movie stars, politicians, millionaires, all drinking by the pool, dancing under gold ceilings, passing marble statues and zebras on the lawn. But tonight the music is gone. The man who built it all, newspaper king William Randolph Hearst, is almost out of money and out of time. The castle that once screamed power is now a quiet prison he can barely afford to keep. And behind every wild party, there was a secret he tried to hide from the whole country. Why did the most powerful newspaper owner in America pour a fortune into a mountain palace he would abandon? How did a boy who grew up dreaming of castles turn that dream into stone walls that slowly crushed his own empire? This is not just a story about a pretty mansion. It is a story about obsession, money, and the price of chasing a dream too far. So what happens when your dream house starts to eat you alive? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1. The night the castle went quiet. The mansion still stands on the ridge where the mountains meet the Pacific Ocean. Tour guides walk through hallways that once echoed with laughter. Visitors swim in pools that hosted Hollywood's brightest stars. But the silence is heavy now. The parties are over. To understand how Hearst Castle became a monument, you have to go back to the boy who dreamed it, the empire that paid for it, and the obsession that nearly destroyed everything. We start with the parties. By the early 1930s, San Simeon was the most famous private home in America. Weekend guests arrived by train, then rode up long, winding mountain roads in a fleet of limousines. What they found at the top seemed impossible. A Spanish Renaissance palace perched on a California hilltop, surrounded by the largest private zoo in the country. The Neptune pool stretched 104 feet, lined with Vermont marble, and framed by a Roman temple facade shipped stone by stone from Europe. The indoor Roman pool glowed blue and gold under a barrel-vaulted ceiling covered in mosaic tiles. Guest cottages the size of mansions dotted the hillside. Zebras grazed on carefully managed grassland. Hearst himself wandered the grounds in a rumpled sweater, pointing out new statues, new gardens, new wings under construction. Friday nights meant formal dinners in the assembly room. Movie stars sat next to senators. Directors pitched ideas to studio chiefs. Hearst presided from the center of a long refectory table, Marion Davies at his side, keeping conversation light and guests comfortable. After dinner came a movie screening in Hearst's private theater, then dancing, then billiards or a walk through moonlit gardens. The rules were strict but simple. Dress for dinner. Lights out by midnight. No business talk at the table, and never ever criticize Hearst or his newspapers in print. Most guests followed the rules. The castle was too beautiful, the access too valuable, the experience too rare to risk losing. This was the American dream made stone and marble. Proof that a boy from San Francisco could build something grander than European nobility, more exclusive than any gentleman's club, more talked about than the White House itself. But by May 1947, that dream was collapsing. The floodlights stayed dark. The guest cottages sat empty. Construction equipment rusted on unfinished terraces. Hearst himself was living in exile in Beverly Hills, his health failing. His fortune drained by decades of spending faster than even a newspaper empire could earn. The castle he built to prove his power had become the symbol of his downfall. What happened between the wild parties and the quiet halls? How does a man spend nearly 30 years building a palace only to lose it before he dies? The answer involves yellow journalism, broken marriages, loyal architects, a devoted mistress, and one simple truth: some dreams are too big to finish and too expensive to abandon. This is the story of that dream. The story of how William Randolph Hearst turned a barren California hillside into the most extravagant party palace in American history. How he filled it with art looted from European estates and guests borrowed from Hollywood's A-list. How he used it as a stage for power, a refuge from scandal, and a monument to appetites that could never quite be satisfied. It is also the story of the people who built it for him, lived in it with him, and watched it slip away when the money finally ran out. The castle still stands, but the man who made it is gone, and the parties he threw are now just whispers in marble halls. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Grew Up in Someone Else's Mansion. The obsession started early in his life. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863 in San Francisco, the son of George Hearst, a rough mining millionaire who struck gold in Nevada and silver in South Dakota, and Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a schoolteacher from Missouri, who married into wealth and never quite forgot her humble beginning. The family had money. What they lacked, at least in the eyes of polite society, was refinement. George Hearst was a practical man who understood ore veins and mining claims, but cared little for art, etiquette, or appearances. Phoebe was different. She wanted culture. She wanted respectability. She wanted her son to grow up as a gentleman, not a miner's kid with dirty hands and rough language. So she filled their San Francisco mansion with rules: proper dress at dinner, classical music lessons, French tutors, art books imported from Europe. Young Willie grew up surrounded by wealth but starved for warmth. His father was often away at mines or in Washington serving as a United States senator. His mother was present but demanding, always pushing him towards some ideal version of manhood he could never quite reach. The house felt like hers, not his. The rules felt like hers. Even the art on the walls, Renaissance paintings, Greek sculptures, Persian rugs, looked like her argument to the world that the Hearsts belonged among San Francisco's old money families, the ones who looked down on mining fortunes as dirty and new. Willie learned early that he was always being measured, never quite good enough, never quite refined enough. The boy who had everything somehow felt he had nothing that truly belonged to him. Then came the trip that changed everything. In 1873, when Willie was 10 years old, Phoebe took him on an 18-month tour of Europe. They visited museums in Paris, galleries in Florence, castles along the Rhine. Phoebe studied art and architecture with the seriousness of a scholar. Willie absorbed something different. He saw power made visible in stone. European nobility lived in castles. They filled those castles with treasures collected over centuries. Walking through those halls meant walking through proof of importance, proof of permanence, proof that your family mattered enough to build something that would outlast you. Willie wanted that. Not the title. America had no titles. But the physical proof, the castle, the art, the weight of history pressing down on visitors, making them understand they stood in the presence of something greater than themselves. The seed was planted. It would take decades to grow, but the boy who felt small in his mother's mansion was already dreaming of a palace he could one day call his own. Back in San Francisco, Willie struggled through school. He was bright but unfocused, charming but difficult, always testing the boundaries his mother tried to enforce. She sent him east to Harvard, hoping the school would polish away his rough edges and turn him into the gentleman she imagined. It did not work. Harvard expelled him after he sent chamber pots engraved with professors' names to the faculty. The prank was expensive and elaborately planned, classic Hearst excess in service of juvenile rebellion. But the expulsion hardly mattered. By then, George Hearst had acquired a failing newspaper called the San Francisco Examiner, mostly to support his political ambitions. Willie convinced his father to let him run it. He was 23 years old, wealthy, reckless, and hungry to prove himself in a way his mother would never approve. Newspapers, it turned out, were perfect for a boy who grew up feeling powerless in his own home. Newspapers let you tell people what to think. Newspapers let you attack your enemies in print where they could not easily fight back. Newspapers let you build something loud and public and undeniably yours. And if you ran them right, newspapers made enough money to buy castles. Chapter 3. Building an Empire with Headlines and Fear. The San Francisco Examiner was dying when Hearst took control in 1887. Circulation was low, advertising was weak, and readers had better options. His father expected the paper to fail quietly. Hearst had different plans. He studied Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, then the most successful newspaper in America, and drew a simple, brutal lesson. Facts by themselves are dull, but stories sell. Pulitzer understood that readers did not want dry reports about city council meetings. They craved drama. They wanted heroes and villains. They wanted to feel something when they opened the morning paper. Hearst took that lesson and pushed it further than anyone else. He hired the best writers he could find and paid them more than any competing paper. He bought better printing presses and used them to run huge illustrations across the front page, drawings of murders, disasters, scandals. He ordered headlines in letters so large they could be read from across the street, and he told his reporters to chase stories that made readers angry, afraid, or amazed. Crime stories received bigger play than their true importance justified. Society scandals were investigated with the intensity of murder cases. Political corruption, real or exaggerated, was exposed with righteous fury on the front page. If a story was not quite dramatic enough, Hearst's editors knew how to sharpen it. A fire became a catastrophe. A disagreement turned into a feud. A minor accident was retold as a tragedy narrowly averted. It worked. Circulation climbed. Advertisers followed. Within a few years, the Examiner was profitable, then dominant. Hearst proved he could master a business his father never truly understood. But San Francisco was too small for the ambitions growing inside him. In 1895, Hearst bought the New York Morning Journal and brought his formula east. New York was the biggest stage in American journalism, and Hearst arrived ready for war. His main rival was Pulitzer himself, now running the world from a golden tower in Lower Manhattan. The two men began a circulation battle that remade American media. Hearst outbid Pulitzer for star writers and cartoonists. He cut his price to 1 penny per copy, selling papers at a loss just to steal readers. He introduced color printing on Sundays and filled those pages with comic strips that turned into national obsessions. His papers screamed louder, printed bigger pictures, told wilder stories. Journalists at the time called it yellow journalism, named after a popular comic strip character printed in yellow ink. The phrase meant sensational stories built on half-truths, emotional appeals, and shameless exaggeration. Hearst wore the label proudly. He was not interested in respectability. He was interested in winning. And then came Cuba. By 1896, Cuba was fighting for independence from Spain. Hearst saw an opportunity and seized it. His papers began running daily stories about Spanish atrocities. Some real, many exaggerated. A few entirely invented. He sent artists to sketch brutal scenes of Spanish soldiers attacking Cuban civilians. He published letters supposedly written by suffering Cubans, begging America to intervene. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898, killing 260 American sailors, Hearst's journal blamed Spain before any investigation could even begin. The headline screamed accusations. The drawings showed Spanish saboteurs planting underwater mines. Editorials demanded war. Historians still debate what actually sank the Maine. The official inquiry at the time blamed a mine. Modern analysis suggests an accidental coal fire that ignited the ship's ammunition. But in 1898, what mattered was not the hidden truth. It was the story Hearst told so loudly that millions accepted it without question. America went to war with Spain. Hearst's circulation soared. And William Randolph Hearst learned the most dangerous lesson of his life. If you control the story, you control reality. If you shout loudly enough, facts begin to bend until they look like whatever you say they are. He had found his power. Now he needed a castle worthy of a king. Chapter 4. Meeting Julia. Morgan, the quiet genius in the background. By 1900, Hearst owned newspapers in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and Los Angeles. His empire was growing. His fortune was secure. But he still had no place that felt like home. He owned properties scattered across the country, apartments in New York, a mansion in San Francisco inherited from his mother after her death in 1919. None of them satisfied the hunger planted during that childhood trip to Europe. They were fine houses, but they were not castles. Then he remembered the ranch. His father had purchased 40,000 acres of ranch land along the California coast near San Simeon in 1865. The land was beautiful but remote, rolling hills covered in oak trees, overlooking the Pacific from high bluffs. George Hearst used it for cattle and for occasional camping trips with his son. Young Willie had loved those trips, the freedom, the open sky, the wind coming off the ocean, the feeling that all this land stretching out in every direction somehow belonged to his family. After his mother's death, Hearst inherited the ranch. He was 56 years old, rich on a scale most people could not imagine, and finally ready to build something permanent. He needed an architect. Most wealthy men in 1919 would have hired a famous firm from New York or Boston, prestigious names that designed in established styles for established families. Hearst made a different choice. He hired Julia Morgan, a 47-year-old architect working quietly out of an office in San Francisco. Morgan was unusual in every way that mattered. She was a woman in a profession completely dominated by men. She was the first woman admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where she studied under the same masters who trained designers of grand European monuments. She had returned to California and built a successful practice designing homes, churches, and institutional buildings, always with careful attention to structure, proportion, and craft. She was small, soft-spoken, and absolutely precise. Where Hearst was expansive and impulsive, Morgan was methodical and grounded. Where he dreamed in grand gestures, she thought in load-bearing walls, drainage systems, and earthquake forces. Hearst had hired her years earlier for smaller projects, renovations, additions, a few buildings on his properties. He trusted her technical skill. More importantly, he trusted her to listen. Morgan did not tell clients what they should want. She listened to what they wanted, and then worked out how to build it. In 1919, Hearst brought Morgan to the hilltop at San Simeon and said something like, "I get tired of going up there and camping in tents. I am getting a little old for that. I would like to build a little something." A little something. Morgan understood immediately that Hearst was not describing anything little. She had worked with him long enough to know that his projects grew, changed, and expanded once they were underway. She knew he collected art and antiquities by the shipload. She knew he wanted something grand enough to match his newspapers, his fortune, and his ego. What she could not have known was that this little something would consume the next 28 years of her life. They began with sketches. Hearst wanted a main house on the hilltop. He called it La Casa Grande, and 3 guest cottages surrounding it. He wanted Mediterranean styles, something reminiscent of the Spanish missions he remembered from childhood, but grander, richer, more elaborate. He wanted towers. He wanted terraces. He wanted pools. Morgan listened. She took notes. She walked the site, studied the slopes, felt the wind. Then she returned to San Francisco and began drawing. The relationship that emerged was unlike any other architect-client partnership in American history. Hearst sent her constant letters filled with ideas, sketches, complaints, and demands. Morgan replied with drawings, cost estimates, and gentle corrections when his ideas defied physics, budgets, or basic engineering. He wanted the impossible. She made it possible. He changed his mind. She adapted. Construction began in 1919. Neither of them knew it would never truly finish. Chapter 5. A playground for a man who never grew up. The first buildings went up quickly. Morgan started with the 3 guest cottages: Casa del Mar, Casa del Monte, and Casa del Sol, each one large enough to be a mansion in its own right. They ringed the hilltop like sentinels, waiting for the main house that would rise between them. Hearst could not wait for completion. By 1920, he was already bringing guests to the half-finished site, hosting them in tents and in the newly completed cottages while construction crews worked around them. He loved showing people the project in motion. He loved pointing to bare foundations and saying, "Here will be the tower." He loved walking visitors through rooms still missing ceilings and describing the Renaissance furniture, carved fireplaces, and tapestries that would one day fill them. The castle grew in layers, constantly shifting as Hearst's tastes evolved. He toured Europe regularly, buying entire rooms from demolished palaces and monasteries, Spanish ceilings, Italian doorways, French fireplaces, Gothic choir stalls. He shipped them back to California in crates and told Morgan to build around them. If a ceiling did not fit the room she had designed, she redesigned the room. If a doorway required moving a wall, she moved the wall. Hearst treated the whole project like the world's most expensive toy. He was building a castle the way a child builds with blocks, adding pieces wherever they looked interesting, unconcerned with perfect symmetry or architectural purity. Morgan somehow made it work. She took his contradictory impulses and wove them into something that felt cohesive, even when it defied almost every classical rule of design. The main house, La Casa Grande, rose 4 stories with twin bell towers reaching toward the sky. The facade mixed Spanish colonial details with Mediterranean proportions and Gothic touches. Inside, rooms flowed into each other without any obvious organizing logic. A Gothic library opened onto a Spanish cloister. A Moorish sitting room led to a Renaissance-style bedroom. The assembly room, the heart of the house, stretched 100 feet long, lined with choir stalls from an Italian monastery and hung with Flemish tapestries. It looked less like a living room and more like a throne hall disguised as a country house interior. Then came the pools. The outdoor Neptune pool began as a simple rectangular design. Hearst rejected it. Too plain. Morgan tried again with classical columns. Better, but still not grand enough for him. She tried again. And again. The Neptune pool went through multiple complete reconstructions over 17 years before reaching its final form. 104 feet of Vermont marble surrounding turquoise water framed by a Roman temple facade and flanked by marble statues of Neptune and the Nereids. The indoor Roman pool took inspiration from ancient baths Hearst had seen in Italy. Morgan covered every surface in hand-set glass mosaic tiles, blue, gold, and orange in elaborate geometric patterns. 8 marble statues of gods and heroes lined the walls. Light filtered through alabaster globe lamps, making the water glow from within. It looked like something Caesar might have built if Caesar had unlimited money and a California architect obsessed with detail. The zoo grew alongside the architecture. Hearst imported animals from around the world: zebras, emus, kangaroos, elk, buffalo, even polar bears. They roamed semi-freely across the hillside in carefully fenced enclosures. Guests driving up the winding road passed zebras grazing near the oak trees, as if this combination of African wildlife and California ranch land were the most natural thing in the world. Every year brought new additions: a tennis court, a second library, more guest rooms, another terrace, a private airstrip. The project had no end date because Hearst had no intention of stopping. Building was the point. Acquiring was the point. He was not creating a home. He was creating proof that William Randolph Hearst could have anything he wanted: rules and budgets and architectural coherence be damned. By 1925, San Simeon was famous. Hollywood knew about it. Political circles whispered about it. Invitations to spend a weekend on the Hill became the most coveted ticket in California. The parties were about to begin. Chapter 6: Marion Davies, the funny girl in the golden cage. The castle needed a queen. Hearst found her in 1915, long before the first stone was laid at San Simeon. Marion Davies was a chorus girl in a Broadway show when they met. She was 18. He was 52, married with 5 sons, and already one of the most powerful men in America. She was funny, warm, quick on her feet, and utterly charming. Qualities that mattered more to Hearst than conventional beauty or high social rank. He fell hard. Within a year, he was financing her movie career, using his newspapers to promote her films, and trying to will her into stardom through raw money and publicity. She did have real talent: sharp comic timing, a loose, natural screen presence, an ability to make even weak material feel alive. But the whispers followed her everywhere. Marion Davies was only famous because William Randolph Hearst said so. The whispers were not entirely wrong. Hearst poured millions into her career. He founded Cosmopolitan Pictures specifically to produce her films. He pressured theater owners to show them. He ordered his critics to praise them, sometimes against their own judgment. When sound came in and other silent stars vanished, Marion made the jump because Hearst paid for the best directors, the best writers, the most lavish sets. He tried to buy her a permanent place in Hollywood. She never escaped the shadow of that support. The industry respected her work, but resented his constant interference. The public liked her movies, but knew she was Hearst's mistress, not his wife. Millicent Hearst, the legal Mrs. Hearst, stayed in New York with the couple's 5 sons, living separately but never agreeing to a divorce. Marion would never wear a wedding ring. She would never be introduced as Mrs. Hearst. She would always be Miss Davies, the actress living with a married man. San Simeon became her refuge and her cage. At the castle, Marion was the unofficial hostess. She greeted guests, kept conversation moving, remembered everyone's names and small preferences, and made Hollywood's biggest egos feel relaxed at Hearst's stiff, rule-bound table. She was genuinely kind. When actors struggled with alcohol, she tried to steady them quietly. When chorus girls needed work, she found them roles. When Hearst's moods turned dark and controlling, she cut through the tension with jokes, impressions, and a kind of emotional warmth no amount of money could buy. She also drank. At first it was social, then steady, then heavier as the years went on. The strain of living under constant gossip, of playing the cheerful hostess every night, of being adored by Hearst, yet never fully accepted by society. It all left marks. The hilltop palace that looked like paradise from the outside sometimes felt to her like a beautiful prison with no exit. And still, she stayed. Through scandals, through rumors, through Hearst's failed political campaigns and public embarrassments, through his financial crises. She stayed because, from everything friends later said, she genuinely loved him. Not the empire, not the headlines, not the power games his newspapers played. She disliked how vicious they could be. She loved the private William Randolph Hearst, the man who could be goofy, generous, and surprisingly fragile when the world was not watching. He built her a 14-room bungalow on the MGM lot in Los Angeles. Another over-the-top gesture, a smaller palace wired into the studio's power grid. He covered her in jewelry. He rewrote scripts to highlight her strengths. He asked her opinion on everything from editorial campaigns to which antique tapestries should hang in which room at the castle. And every weekend he flew or drove with her to the hilltop, where for a few days they could pretend the rest of the world and its rules did not exist. Marion made San Simeon feel warm. She took Hearst's monument to his own ego and softened it into something closer to an actual home. The castle had its architect in Julia Morgan and its builder in William Randolph Hearst, but its heart, the reason guests wanted to come back, was Marion Davies. Without her, the parties would have been pure display. With her, they almost felt like gatherings of friends. Almost. Chapter 7. Hollywood on the Hill, the wildest party palace in America. The routine almost never changed. Friday afternoon, a private train car pulled out of Los Angeles carrying anywhere from 15 to 30 invited guests. By early evening, they reached San Luis Obispo, where Hearst's limousines waited to collect them and begin the slow climb up the winding 5-mile road to the castle. The drive took nearly an hour. Through the windows, guests watched the landscape shift from coastal scrub to oak-dotted hills, the air growing cooler as they gained height. Every so often they caught sight of zebras or buffalo grazing in the golden light, animals that had no business being on a California ranch, yet somehow fit perfectly into Hearst's private world. Then the road curved one final time, and the castle appeared on the ridge. White towers glowing against the darkening sky. Floodlights washing over pools and terraces. It looked like something from a dream, or from a movie set, which was precisely the point. Charlie Chaplin came regularly. So did Clark Gable, Greta Garbo, Cary Grant, Carole Lombard, Joan Crawford. At one time or another, nearly every major star of Hollywood's golden age spent a weekend at San Simeon, along with directors, producers, writers, and the occasional politician or business tycoon. The guest list was invitation only and gloriously unpredictable. A silent film comedian might find himself seated next to a Supreme Court justice. A Broadway actress might end up talking by the pool with a British lord. The castle ran on rules that somehow felt both relaxed and strict. Guests were assigned rooms, some in La Casa Grande, others in the cottages, each one furnished with Renaissance furniture and museum-quality art. They were expected to dress formally for dinner, cocktails at 7:30 in the assembly room, dinner at 9, served at a long refectory table that could seat 40. Hearst took the center spot, Marion beside him, the rest of the guests scattered without any obvious order of rank or importance. The food was surprisingly plain. For all the opulence around them, Hearst preferred straightforward dishes, roast chicken, simple vegetables, basic desserts. He disliked elaborate French cuisine and saw no reason to serve it just to show off. Ketchup and mustard bottles sat openly on the table, next to fine china and crystal, a small reminder that the man paying for everything still thought like a rancher's son. Conversation at dinner was lively but bounded by invisible lines. People told stories, gossiped, flirted, but no one talked business deals. No one started political arguments at the table. And absolutely no one criticized Hearst or his newspapers where he might hear it. San Simeon was presented as neutral ground a place to escape studio pressure and professional rivalries, as long as everyone remembered who owned the hill. After dinner came the movie. Hearst's private theater, with around 50 seats, ran the newest Hollywood releases, often before they opened to the public. Studio heads sent him advance prints as a courtesy and as a form of insurance. A positive mention in his newspapers could make a film. A bad one could hurt it. Marion's films always played to warm applause, whether the picture was good, mediocre, or worse. No one wanted to be the guest who did not laugh. Then the night shifted into smaller groups, dancing in one of the sitting rooms, billiards, card games, or slow walks through moonlit gardens while the Pacific wind moved through the trees. All of it stopped when Hearst's bedtime rule kicked in. Lights out at midnight. The public rooms went dark, and the host withdrew. Guests could stay awake in their rooms, but the performance of the evening was officially over. Saturday had its own rhythm. Swimming in the Neptune or Roman pools, tennis on the courts, horseback rides across the hills. Lounging on sunlit terraces while servants brought drinks and light meals. Some guests wandered the endless rooms, stunned by the art collection. Tapestries, statues, ceilings stolen from Europe and rebuilt on the hilltop. Others napped or quietly worked on scripts and correspondence. The atmosphere felt easygoing, but there was always an unspoken bargain underneath it. You were here because Hearst allowed it. You enjoyed a level of luxury almost no hotel on earth could match, and in exchange, you did not cross him. Not in print, not in public, not in front of his staff. Most guests adored the arrangement. It was a chance to network with Hollywood's elite in a setting that felt almost unreal. A chance to see art that usually lived behind velvet ropes, here scattered through hallways and guest bedrooms. A chance to swim in what many called the most beautiful pools in America, while zebras grazed in the background like extras in some strange studio production. But a few visitors found the experience unsettling. They noticed how closely Hearst watched everything. They understood how his newspapers could elevate or ruin careers with a handful of headlines. They felt, beneath the generous hospitality, that this paradise came with strings they could not quite see but definitely felt. The castle was many things at once: a playground, a museum, a private studio lot, a stage set for its owner. What it was not, and never really tried to be, was a normal home. It was a demonstration of power dressed up as a weekend getaway. And that demonstration was about to get much darker. Chapter 8: Power, Politics, and the Newspaper King. Hearst was not satisfied with just running Hollywood's favorite weekend escape. Controlling the social scene was fun. What he really wanted was political power big enough to match his money and his media. By the mid-1920s, his newspaper empire had become enormous. He owned 28 newspapers in 18 cities, plus magazines, newsreel companies, and film studios. Roughly 1 in 4 Americans read a Hearst publication every day. That meant 1 in 4 Americans saw the world at least partly through William Randolph Hearst's lens, whether they realized it or not. He used that power aggressively. His papers championed causes he believed in. Sometimes progressive, sometimes conservative, often contradictory. He supported labor unions one year and attacked them the next. He pushed for government ownership of railroads while loudly defending private enterprise in other sectors. He opposed American involvement in European conflicts, yet had no problem stirring up support for military action in Latin America when it suited him. The only constant was Hearst himself. His newspapers mirrored his moods, his grudges, his shifting interests, and his ambitions. And Hearst had very real political ambitions. He ran for mayor of New York in 1905 and lost by a narrow margin. He ran for governor of New York in 1906 and lost again. Each campaign cost him a fortune. Between races, he poured money into candidates who promised to back his ideas. then turned his newspapers on them with shocking ferocity when they disappointed him. Presidents courted his endorsement. Senators feared his attacks. Local politicians across the country checked Hearst's editorials before committing to controversial positions. You did not need his support to survive, but it certainly helped. You definitely did not want his papers turned against you. San Simeon became more than a party palace. It became a political stage. Senators slipped up to the hilltop for quiet weekends, where upcoming bills could be discussed far from cameras. Governors appeared when Hearst wanted to talk about state contracts, utility rates, or tax policies. Presidential hopefuls made pilgrimages to the castle, fully aware that favorable front-page coverage in Hearst papers could nudge an election. The castle offered the one thing politicians wanted almost as much as publicity: privacy. At San Simeon, away from rival journalists and party operatives, deals could be floated, tested, and refined without leaving a paper trail. Hearst could spell out what he wanted. Politicians could feel out how far they could go without provoking hostile headlines. Everyone smiled for photos by the Neptune pool, knowing the real negotiations were happening on shaded terraces and in quiet sitting rooms after dinner. The line between journalism and political manipulation did not just blur, it vanished. When Hearst opposed a policy, his papers framed it as a looming catastrophe. When he supported a candidate, that candidate suddenly enjoyed glowing profiles on the front page, while opponents were dragged through stories about petty scandals, old rumors, and carefully chosen questions of character. Facts became flexible tools, arranged to serve Hearst's chosen narrative. His editors understood that their job was not to provide neutral truth. Their job was to help William Randolph Hearst win. Hollywood guests watched all this with mixed emotions. Some admired the raw power. The idea that a single man could shake presidents by rattling a printing press. Others found it unnerving. But everyone understood that crossing Hearst carried consequences. An actor who annoyed him might find vicious gossip about their personal life splashed across his entertainment pages. A director who criticized his politics might see their films mysteriously savaged by Hearst's reviewers. A producer who refused to book Marion's pictures could suddenly have trouble getting any of their other movies covered positively. The castle's hospitality came with invisible chains. Most guests never felt those chains because they never tugged on them. They swam in the pools, complimented Marion's films, steered clear of politics at the table, and went home with good memories and useful connections. The system ran smoothly because almost no one tested the limits. But Marion saw the darker reality. She watched senators and governors flatter Hearst to his face, then roll their eyes the moment he left the room. She saw studio executives laughing at his jokes in the assembly room, then complaining bitterly about his interference once they were back in Los Angeles. She understood that many guests did not come because they loved Hearst. They came because they feared him or needed him. And she watched Hearst himself grow more isolated even as he surrounded himself with crowds. He had power, he had wealth, he had the most spectacular residence in America, but he had very few people around him who loved him for anything other than what he could provide. The castle was a throne, and thrones are lonely places even when they are full of guests, especially when they are full of guests. Chapter 9. The People Below the Stairs. While movie stars sipped cocktails by the Neptune pool, another population kept San Simeon alive. The staff, the workers, the people whose names never appeared in gossip columns, but whose labor made every glittering weekend possible. At its peak, San Simeon employed more than 150 people full-time: maids, cooks, gardeners, electricians, plumbers, drivers, animal keepers for the zoo, guards to patrol the grounds, switchboard operators, secretaries. A workforce large enough to run a hotel, a ranch, and a private resort all at once, working in shifts around the clock to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury. They lived in dormitories, and staff housing scattered across the property, far from the main house where guests might notice them. They worked long hours for wages that were decent by 1920s standards, but far from generous considering the size of Hearst's fortune. And they followed strict rules about how, when, and if they could interact with guests or with the Hearsts themselves. Staff were expected to be invisible. A maid cleaning a guest room was supposed to disappear if she heard footsteps in the hallway. Gardeners working near the terraces stepped back and moved out of sight when Hearst or his guests came outside. Drivers waited in hot cars for hours without complaint. Cooks prepared meals for dozens, but never tasted them in the dining room. The castle was staged to feel like a place that maintained itself by magic. Rooms always spotless, gardens always perfect, food always appearing on time, with no visible labor behind it. The class divide was absolute. Hearst treated his staff with distant politeness, but never with anything that resembled equality. He knew the head gardener's name, but not the names of the dozen men who worked under him. He recognized excellent service, but showed little curiosity about the lives of the people providing it. To him, they were essential components of the castle's operation, parts of the machine no different from the plumbing or the electrical systems. Some staff members stayed for years, even decades. The work was steady. The setting was beautiful. Many had seen far worse employers in California. Others left quickly, worn down by the isolation and rigid hierarchy. San Simeon sat nearly 50 miles from the nearest sizable town. Staff had limited time off and no easy way to leave the property. For people who came from farms or small communities, the ranch could start to feel less like opportunity and more like a self-chosen confinement. The cooks worked in industrial kitchens far below the grand dining room, preparing meals for 40 or more guests at a time, using recipes Hearst approved personally. They turned out simple dishes on priceless china, cooking everyday food for people who could afford anything in the world. The irony was not lost on them. The maids cleaned rooms filled with Renaissance paintings and medieval tapestries, scrubbing marble floors beneath ceilings imported from European palaces. They earned in a month what one of Hearst's antique chairs cost. They kept the castle pristine, yet lived in bare dormitories with shared bathrooms and almost no decoration. The gardeners maintained 83 acres of ornamental plantings, including exotic species shipped from around the globe. They pruned, watered, fertilized, and replanted constantly to keep the grounds perfect for guests, who often walked past without really seeing any of the work. When Hearst decided that a full-grown oak tree should be moved 50 feet to improve a view, they were the ones who moved it. The animal keepers fed and cared for the zoo's imported collection: zebras, elk, bears, monkeys, and more. The animals were costly, temperamental, and sometimes dangerous. Keepers worked in every kind of weather, dealing with injuries, illnesses, and escapes, while Hearst proudly showed off the menagerie to delighted visitors who only saw the novelty of African wildlife on California hillsides. These workers built the castle alongside Julia Morgan's construction crews. They kept it running during its glory years, and they watched from the edges as the fortune that paid them slowly began to crack. Because while Hearst spent millions on art and construction, he sometimes delayed staff paychecks when cash flow tightened. While he bought entire rooms ripped from European estates, workers requested basic repairs to their own housing and were told to wait. The people who kept his paradise functioning were the first to feel the pain when his empire strained. They were loyal, they were skilled, they were essential, and they were almost completely invisible to the man whose dream they sustained with their hands and their time. Chapter 10. Cracks in the Marble. Debt, Doubt, and Isolation. The first cracks appeared in 1929, but Hearst refused to see them. The stock market crashed in October. Banks failed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. The Depression settled over America like a long, dark winter. Newspapers lost advertising as businesses slashed their budgets. Circulation dropped as unemployed workers stopped buying daily papers. Revenue that had flowed steadily for decades slowed to a thin, unreliable trickle. Hearst kept spending. He bought more art. He added more rooms to San Simeon. He financed more of Marion's films. He kept his newspaper empire operating at full strength even as competitors folded or merged to survive. He behaved as if money were an endless river, as if his empire was too big to sink, as if economic disaster was something that happened to other people, ordinary people, not to William Randolph Hearst. His accountants told him otherwise. His sons begged him to cut costs. His business managers brought him detailed reports showing the gap between income and expenses widening every month. Hearst ignored them all. He had built his empire by thinking big and spending boldly. To him, cutting back did not feel like sensible business. It felt like surrender. The bills kept coming. Art dealers demanded payment for pieces he had purchased years earlier. Construction at San Simeon consumed millions of dollars annually. Payroll for thousands of employees across his newspaper chain arrived every month without fail. Property taxes were due on estates scattered across the country. Marion's film productions, many of them loss-making, needed fresh injections of cash. The zoo on the hill required constant, expensive care. By 1935, Hearst owed roughly $125 million, the equivalent of around $2 billion in modern terms. His assets were enormous, but mostly illiquid. He owned newspapers, real estate, and vast art collections worth hundreds of millions, but he could not turn them into cash fast enough to keep up with his debts. Eventually, the banks stepped in. In 1937, a consortium of creditors took control of Hearst's finances. They installed their own managers to oversee his empire and placed strict limits on what he could spend. They began selling assets. Newspapers were shut down or sold off. Real estate holdings were liquidated. And most painfully for Hearst, they started selling his art, the treasures he had spent 4 decades collecting: Renaissance paintings, Greek sculptures, medieval tapestries. Pieces that filled San Simeon and his other properties, each one once chosen by him, now tagged with a price. Gimbel's department store in New York held a public sale of Hearst's collection. Thousands of items were displayed across multiple floors. Wealthy buyers walked through, selecting pieces Hearst had once taken from European palaces and noble estates. The newspapers, including some that used to fear him, covered the sale as a spectacle of humiliation. The man who had spent his life acquiring objects to prove he would never lose anything was now selling them off, one by one, to pay his creditors. Construction at San Simeon stopped completely. Workers were dismissed. Plans for new wings and terraces were abandoned mid-project. Scaffolding stood around unfinished walls. The castle that had grown continuously for 18 years suddenly froze, its half-completed sections left exposed to weather and time. Under the weight of all this, Hearst seemed to age overnight. He was 74 years old. His health was declining. His life's work was being dismantled by bankers who treated him like a reckless teenager with a maxed-out credit line. The man who had once bent public opinion with a headline now had to ask permission to spend his own money. Marion watched the change with a growing sense of helplessness. The restless energy that had driven him for decades dwindled. He became short-tempered, withdrawn, fixated on small details of the castle's decor because he could no longer control the larger forces tearing his empire apart. She tried to shield him from bad news, tried to joke, to host, to keep San Simeon feeling alive. But the reality was impossible to hide. The dream was collapsing. The parties at San Simeon became less frequent, then rare, and finally stopped altogether. Invitations to the Hill were no longer the most coveted tickets in California. The castle fell quiet. Staff levels dropped to a skeleton crew. Whole sections of La Casa Grande were closed off to save on heating and maintenance. Rooms that had once echoed with laughter and music stood dark and locked, their tapestries and ceilings now assets on a banker's spreadsheet. By 1947, doctors told Hearst he could no longer live at San Simeon. The castle was too remote, the road too long and winding for emergency care. If something happened to him up there, help might not arrive in time. He needed to be closer to Los Angeles, closer to hospitals and specialists. In May of 1947, William Randolph Hearst left San Simeon for the last time. He moved into a rented house in Beverly Hills, smaller, plainer, closer to the world he had once dominated and now could only watch from the sidelines. Closer, too, to the end that was coming whether he accepted it or not. The castle remained on its hill, empty, quiet. A marble and concrete monument to dreams that grew too large, appetites that never learned to stop, and a man who discovered that even the biggest empire has a breaking point. Chapter 11. Leaving the Hill. The Beverly Hills house felt like a prison compared to the castle. Smaller rooms, lower ceilings, no towers, no terraces, no marble pools reaching toward the Pacific. Just a comfortable mansion on a quiet street where an old man could fade away without causing too much fuss. Hearst spent his final years shuffling between those modest rooms, reading newspapers he no longer truly controlled, watching his empire move on without him. The banks had stabilized his finances by selling off enough assets to satisfy creditors. But the price was everything that had made him William Randolph Hearst. His newspaper chain was smaller. His political influence was gone. His art collection was scattered. And San Simeon, the physical manifestation of his power and ego, sat empty on a distant hilltop he would never see again. Marion stayed with him. She did not have to. By then she was wealthy in her own right, with money saved from her film work and investments she had made independently of Hearst. She could have gone back to Hollywood, rebuilt her social life, and escaped the slow, suffocating routine of watching a once dominant man shrink. But she stayed. She stayed through his declining health, through his bitter moods, through his growing dependence on nurses, doctors, and medication. She stayed because, after 36 years together, walking away felt less like freedom and more like tearing out a piece of her own life. Hearst died on August 14, 1951, at the age of 88. Marion was at his bedside, his wife Millicent. Still legally Mrs. Hearst, despite decades of separation, flew in from New York for the funeral. His 5 sons came as well. Hollywood sent flowers and polished statements of respect. The newspapers he had founded ran long obituaries trying to measure his legacy. Marion was not invited to the funeral. The Hearst family made that clear. She had been his partner for more than 3 decades, but she had never been his wife. And now that he was gone, the family closed ranks. In the official mourning, she did not exist. 36 years vanished with one unspoken decision. She would be left out. She accepted it without public complaint. She had never really expected anything else. The castle had been her home, but never truly hers. The life she built with Hearst existed inside a legal gray zone that ended the moment his heart stopped. After his death, the Hearst family controlled everything: the businesses, the estates, and San Simeon itself. And they faced an immediate, brutal problem. The castle was enormously expensive to maintain. Utilities for hundreds of rooms, staff to keep the place from falling apart, repairs to buildings that had already suffered from years of harsh weather and deferred maintenance, property taxes that felt like a punishment. And the family had no practical use for a 240-room Mediterranean-style palace on a remote California hilltop. They weighed their options: sell it privately to some billionaire, demolish it, and write the whole thing off as a bad memory. lock it up, and let it quietly decay. None of those options felt right. The castle was too famous to destroy, too expensive and strange to sell easily, and too historically significant, even in their eyes, to just abandon to the wind and fog. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation made a decision. It donated San Simeon to the state of California. The family kept the surrounding ranch land but gave the castle, the guest cottages, the pools, and 123 acres of hilltop to the public. The condition was simple and clear. It had to become a state historical monument, preserved and opened for guided tours. It was a practical solution to an impossible problem. The state would fund maintenance through admission fees. The Hearst name would stay attached to something grand rather than to a ruined carcass on a crumbling hill. And the public would finally be allowed inside the legendary castle that, for nearly 40 years, had been visible from the highway, but closed to anyone without an invitation. California accepted. Plans began to convert the private palace into a public museum. Staff were hired, tour routes were mapped, safety regulations were imposed, ropes and signs went up where once only servants walked. The castle that Hearst had built to keep the world at a controlled distance would now open its doors to anyone willing to buy a ticket and follow a tour guide. Marion Davies watched all of this unfold from far away. She never returned to San Simeon after Hearst died. The place held too many memories, and none of them belonged to her in any official sense. She had been the castle's beating heart for decades, but the historical summaries would mention her, if at all, as a footnote. She died in 1961, 10 years after Hearst, wealthy, comfortable, and largely forgotten by the Hollywood that had once begged for her attention. The castle outlived them both. Chapter 12. What Remains of a Dream. The first public tours began in June 1958. Visitors rode up the same winding road that had once carried Hollywood's elite, but now they arrived in buses instead of limousines. They paid $2 for admission, roughly $20 in modern terms, and followed guides through rooms that still smelled faintly of old money and faded ambition. The guides told a polished, gentle version of the story. They introduced Hearst as a newspaper publisher and art collector. They pointed out Renaissance ceilings and medieval tapestries, but did not mention how many papers he had closed or how much debt he had piled up to buy them. They showed the Neptune pool and the assembly room without saying a word about the political deals made in those spaces, or the way Hearst once bent American opinion from those hilltop rooms. Marion Davies was barely mentioned. In the official script, she appeared as a passing detail, an actress who sometimes visited. There was nothing about her 3 decades as the castle's hostess, nothing about her quiet help for struggling actors, nothing about her loyalty to a man who could never make her his wife. History was being edited in real time, sanding off the messy parts to give tourists a simple, easy-to-digest story. Early visitors walked through the castle with mixed reactions. Some were stunned by the sheer luxury. Others thought it was gaudy, even ridiculous. Many simply could not figure out what they were looking at. Architectural styles collided. The scale felt overwhelming. Mediterranean revival sat next to Gothic fragments and Renaissance furniture, creating something that refused neat labels. It was not a palace in any traditional European sense. It was not quite a museum, though it contained museum-quality art. It felt like a strange hybrid. A rich man's fantasy made solid, now open to the public, almost like a theme park attraction. Former staff members sometimes joined the tours, blending into the crowd as paying visitors. They walked past spaces they had once scrubbed, polished, or repaired. They noticed details others would never see. A faint stain on marble they had tried to remove, a terrace where they had worked through brutal heat, a doorway where Hearst had stood giving orders. They rarely spoke up. Their memories were not part of the official script. The castle's public story focused on the builder and his famous guests, not on the people who actually kept the whole machine running. The state set about stabilizing the property. Years of deferred maintenance had left scars. Roofs leaked. Pipes had corroded. Gardens had gone wild. Restoration began slowly, funded by admission fees that increased as word spread about the castle's strange, hypnotic grandeur. Journalists rediscovered San Simeon. Magazine features labeled it Hearst's Folly, his monument to excess, his real-life Xanadu. The comparison to Citizen Kane was unavoidable. Orson Welles had loosely based his 1941 film on Hearst's life, and the fictional Xanadu, a vast, empty palace where a lonely tycoon dies surrounded by things instead of people, seemed to predict San Simeon's fate with eerie accuracy. Hearst had hated Citizen Kane. He used his newspapers to attack the film, pressured theaters not to show it, and tried to bury it completely. That campaign failed. The movie became a classic, and now tourists walked through the real Hearst Castle, quietly comparing it to Welles's invention and wondering how much of the film's darker portrait had been true. Over time, the castle's meaning shifted. It stopped being read purely as a symbol of success and started to look more like a warning. Look what happens when wealth and ego are given no limits. Look what is left when the guests leave and the parties stop. Look at this beautiful, lonely place, built to impress people who never truly cared about the man behind it. And still, people kept coming. Thousands per year at first, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The private world Hearst had constructed to exclude the masses became one of California's most visited tourist sites. School groups marched through its halls. Families on road trips checked it off their list. Architecture students took notes. Travelers from around the world arrived to see the hilltop where Hollywood royalty had once played. The dream Hearst built to prove his own importance now belonged to everyone. That irony alone might have enraged him more than any bad headline. Chapter 13. The Dark Side in the Marble. The tours did not tell the whole story. They could not. The truth was too complicated, too uncomfortable, and too far from the polite narrative California wanted to attach to one of its most famous landmarks. Behind every stone at San Simeon stood the empire that paid for it. And that empire was built on something much darker than art collecting and architectural ambition. Hearst's newspapers changed America, and not in a good way. They helped pioneer a form of journalism that put emotion ahead of accuracy, sensation ahead of truth, profit ahead of public good. When Hearst needed circulation, his papers invented or stretched scandals. When he wanted war, his headlines manufactured outrage. When he opposed a political candidate, his front pages went to work, destroying reputations with half-truths and carefully engineered lies. The Spanish-American War was the clearest example, but it was far from the only one. Hearst's papers spent decades stoking fear of immigrants, especially Chinese and Japanese communities on the West Coast. They published openly racist cartoons and inflammatory editorials that helped justify discriminatory laws and encouraged violence. They sensationalized crime in ways that fueled panic without making anyone safer. They turned complex political debates into simple morality plays where Hearst's chosen side was always heroic and the opposition was always corrupt. This was not some side effect unrelated to San Simeon. This was the engine that made it possible. Every tower, every pool, every imported ceiling was paid for by newspapers that made the country angrier, more fearful, and more divided. The castle was breathtaking. The foundation was rotten. Hearst himself seemed to feel no guilt. He believed his papers printed truths that respectable media ignored. He saw himself as a champion of ordinary people against corrupt elites. Even as he lived in a palace that made most European nobles look modest, the contradiction never appeared to trouble him. The castle also told a larger American story about the Gilded Age and what came after, a time when individuals could pile up obscene fortunes with almost no regulation or accountability. Hearst inherited his starting capital from his father's mining operations, then multiplied it through a media empire that faced no real checks on its power to mislead, manipulate, or destroy. He built San Simeon in an era when labor protections were thin, environmental rules were non-existent, and the gap between rich and working Americans was already vast and widening. The castle's construction employed hundreds of workers who slept in plain dormitories while Hearst dozed under carved Renaissance ceilings. The zoo's exotic animals were ripped from wild populations with no thought for conservation. The art collection was assembled by buying treasures from a Europe shaken by war and economic collapse, from aristocratic families who sold centuries of heritage because they had no other choice. Modern visitors walking through San Simeon see beauty and excess. What they often miss is the web of exploitation that made it all possible, the workers who built it and maintained it, the species reduced in the wild to decorate a hillside zoo, the European families forced by desperation to sell their history, the newspaper readers who were manipulated into backing policies and wars that served Hearst's influence more than their own interests. The comparison to today is uncomfortable but hard to avoid. Hearst's media model, emotionally charged, flexible with facts, optimized to grab attention rather than to inform, never really disappeared. It adapted, first to radio, then to television, then to cable news, now to social media feeds and algorithmic timelines. The core principle stayed the same: capture attention by any means necessary, monetize that attention, and use the resulting power to push your own agenda. San Simeon stands as a monument to where that path can lead. Not to lasting wisdom or genuine respect, but to a stunning, hollow castle that outlived its creator and ended up as a cautionary tale about confusing wealth with wisdom, power with purpose, and publicity with legacy. Every visitor who walks past the Neptune pool steps through a kind of crime scene, not a crime of blood, but a crime of values. A life spent accumulating more instead of understanding more, taking instead of giving, shouting instead of listening. The marble is still beautiful, but the stains go deep. Chapter 14. Julia Morgan and Marion Davies, the other builders. The castle's story was never just about Hearst. Two women shaped San Simeon as deeply as the man whose name it carries, yet their roles were minimized, blurred, or quietly erased from the version of history told to the public. Julia Morgan worked on San Simeon for 28 years. She made more than 800 trips from her San Francisco office to the remote hilltop, traveling by train and car over rough roads. She supervised construction crews, solved the engineering problems created by Hearst's chaotic imagination, and turned his constantly shifting ideas into buildings that actually stood and survived earthquakes, storms, and time. She was, in every sense, a genius. Her technical skill was extraordinary. She understood materials, loads, stresses, and structural limits in a way very few architects of her era could match. At the same time, she was an artist, able to blend clashing architectural styles into something that felt strangely unified. Hearst demanded the impossible. Julia Morgan sat down with pencil and tracing paper and made the impossible real. She did all this while fighting battles Hearst never even had to think about. As a woman in a male-dominated profession, she faced constant skepticism from contractors, suppliers, and inspectors who assumed she did not belong on a building site. She proved them wrong again and again, but the proving never stopped. Every project required her to demonstrate competence that male architects were simply granted by default. Morgan was paid well by the standards of the time, but never as lavishly as Hearst's dependence on her might suggest. He valued her work, yet took advantage of her patience and professionalism. He changed plans constantly, forcing her to redraw elevations and recalculate structures. He delayed payments when cash grew tight. He demanded her attention on weekends and holidays, expecting detailed responses to late-night letters and telegrams. She accepted these conditions because San Simeon was the commission of a lifetime, a project of such scale and complexity that almost no other architect would ever see anything like it. And then, when Hearst's finances collapsed and construction stopped, Morgan was simply dismissed. No grand farewell, no public recognition of nearly 3 decades of brilliance. She went back to her San Francisco office and quietly returned to smaller projects until she retired. When California opened San Simeon for tours, her name was barely spoken. Guides told visitors Hearst built when they meant Morgan designed and Hearst paid for. The architectural achievement was credited to the client instead of the architect. Morgan never complained publicly. She had always preferred to let the building speak for her. But the injustice was real. The castle people admired was as much hers as his, yet history chose to remember only one name. Marion Davies suffered a different kind of erasure. She was written out of the castle's story almost completely after Hearst's death. The Hearst family wanted the decades-long affair to vanish from view. Tour guides said little or nothing about her. Photographs where she appeared too prominently were rotated out or filed away. The warmth and humor she brought to San Simeon vanished from the official narrative. Yet Marion's legacy stretched far beyond being Hearst's mistress at the castle. After his death, she used her own considerable fortune, built not just from his support, but from shrewd investments she made herself, for tangible good. She funded children's hospitals. She supported clinics treating polio. She quietly sent money to struggling actors and crew members she remembered from her film days. While Hearst spent decades projecting power, she spent her later years quietly writing checks that actually changed lives. For most of her career, the joke in Hollywood was that she only succeeded because of Hearst's money. The truth was far more complicated. Yes, he financed her films and used his newspapers to promote them. But she had genuine talent that even skeptical critics admitted. Sharp comic timing, an easy, natural presence on screen, and a reputation for kindness off camera. Her career may have rested on Hearst's backing, but her character did not. That belonged entirely to her. Both women, Julia Morgan and Marion Davies, gave years of their lives to Hearst's dream. Both were essential in shaping what San Simeon became. One made the castle stand, the other made it feel alive. Both were brilliant in different ways, and both were reduced to footnotes in a story that kept the spotlight on a man who could never have built any of it alone. History is slowly correcting this. Modern tours mention Morgan by name and acknowledge her role. Biographies and documentaries treat Marion more sympathetically, highlighting her loyalty and her philanthropy instead of just the scandal. Scholars now recognize that San Simeon is as much a monument to these two women as it is to Hearst himself. But for decades, the story of the castle was told as if William Randolph Hearst single-handedly willed it into existence through money and determination. He did not. He never could have. The castle stands where it does, and as it does, because two extraordinary women made it stand. Chapter 15. The Hill, the Sea, and the Stories We Leave Behind. The sun rises over San Simeon much the same way it did 100 years ago. Golden light creeps across the hillside, touching the white towers first, then spilling down over terraces and pools. The Pacific stretches endlessly beyond, shimmering and indifferent to the palace on the bluff. Tour groups arrive early, gathering in the visitor center below before buses carry them up the winding road. They come from everywhere. Families on vacation, architecture students with sketchbooks, history obsessives, curious travelers who heard about Hearst Castle and want to see what all the stories were about. They walk through the same rooms where Charlie Chaplin laughed, and senators made quiet deals. They stand in the assembly room where headlines were once born over coffee and gossip. Some of them, on rare special days, wade briefly into the Neptune pool for photos, dipping their feet where Hollywood royalty once swam. Most visitors leave impressed by the beauty and scale. Some leave unsettled by the excess. A few leave thinking seriously about the man who built it and what his story actually says. William Randolph Hearst wanted to be remembered. That much is obvious. He wanted a monument that would outlast his body, prove his importance, and show that a boy from San Francisco could build something grander than kings and nobles. In that narrow sense, he succeeded. The castle stands. His name is still on the signs. Hundreds of thousands of people visit every year and say the word Hearst out loud. But what they remember is not what he intended. They remember the excess. They remember the loneliness implied by empty halls built for crowds that no longer come. They remember the cautionary tale, a story about dreams that grow too large and appetites that never learn to stop. Many of them think of Citizen Kane before they think of Hearst himself. The castle teaches uncomfortable lessons about the American dream, about what happens when success is measured only in what you can accumulate, about the gap between building something impressive and building something meaningful, about how dangerous it is to confuse publicity with legacy, power with purpose, possessions with happiness. Hearst spent decades collecting art, land, headlines, political influence, famous friends. He died wealthy but diminished, separated from the hilltop that defined him, his empire dismantled, his image already turning into myth and rumor. The things he built outlasted him, but they tell a version of his story he never would have approved. Yet there is something almost hopeful in what San Simeon has become. The palace that once pushed ordinary people away now invites them in. The estate built to showcase one man's superiority now treats everyone the same. First come, first served, follow the tour. School children walk through rooms designed for millionaires. Tourists from modest backgrounds stand under ceilings bought from European palaces. People who might once have been mocked in Hearst's newspapers now stroll freely through his private world. The monument to inequality turned, slowly and awkwardly, into a small victory for public access. And maybe that is the real legacy. Not the building itself, but what happened to it after the builder lost control. Not the parties, but what came after the music stopped. Not Hearst's original dream, but what the rest of us chose to do with the ruins of that dream once he could no longer direct the script. Most of us will never build castles. We will not run empires, host movie stars, or see our names in history textbooks. But all of us build smaller worlds through the choices we make, the work we do, the relationships we nurture, the way we use whatever power we happen to have. We all leave stories behind, even if they are not carved in marble or preserved by the state. The question San Simeon quietly asks is simple. What kind of story do you want to leave? One of accumulation or contribution? Of power over others or service to others? A story that puts you at the center of every scene, or one that acknowledges the people who helped you build whatever you built? Hearst chose accumulation. He chose power. He chose himself. And he ended his life in a rented house, far from the castle that was supposed to prove his greatness. The castle remains on the hill, beautiful, unnecessary, honest in ways its builder never intended. The ocean continues beyond it, vast and patient, outlasting headlines, empires, and egos alike. The story we leave behind matters less than we like to believe, but how we treat people while we are writing that story matters far more than we realize. San Simeon stands as proof of both truths.